Vidmori POV. The foundry work was both interesting and monotonous all at once. All I really needed to do was just stand there and run my mana through the console like I'd been instructed to from the outset. I'm sure there would be more for me to do and likely focus on if I were the actual Crucible Master. Likely his role in all of this was more akin to an overseer or a foreman, just watching over everyone and everything to make sure it ran smoothly. But with the rest of the foundry being closed for the night, and the fact that these men and women were true professionals in their fields, made it so I didn't have to focus on much save for the temperature gauge. As for the workers themselves, they seemed to be divided between two different output stations as they produce separate products. On one side, they seemed to be preparing long poles or bars. They reminded me of some kind of support beams or materials to make frames, so likely they're said to be used in some kind of construction, or to reinforce some kind of structure somewhere. On the other side of the massive crucible, they appeared to be shaping ingots. The speed and efficiency with which they worked were astonishing when I considered the few experiences I had, touring modern steel mills my family provided security for, before everything collapsed. The memories were still fresh in my mind thanks to the dream walking I had done not too long ago. Besides watching the work play out before me, I ended up needing to be mindful of the Crucible Master's assistant, who dutifully stayed by my side throughout the night. As far as I could tell, he was stepping up to the plate, acting as the foreman in the Crucible Master's absence, as he called out instructions and observations to the best of his ability, while looking over some kind of clipboard that was filled with notes and instructions. Beyond that, he was frankly rather attentive when it came to me, his eyes often studying me, as he seemed to search for signs of stress or exhaustion that I wasn't displaying. In the end, I had to at least pretend to have some sort of physical reaction to the intense heat I was subjecting myself to ease the poor guy's growing worries. The results of which turned out to be rather interesting, as I began to conjure balls of water into my storage before releasing them under the surface of my wood. Somehow, the illusion managed to translate this into a somewhat accurate depiction of sweating, as the water slowly permeated through the living wood of my body. When it came to actually conjuring the water, it was an odd mental exercise in multitasking, since I had to still maintain the heat of the crucible, while both conjuring the water and pulling it out of my storage. The mental gymnastics that took place required a great deal of my focus to achieve, and it felt a lot like trying to rub your belly while patting your head and jumping in place on one foot. Yet, somehow, I managed to do it without compromising the heat of the crucible. I wonder how I could apply this in combat if it came down to it. Not necessarily just combining the two elements via some branches of hybrid elements, but casting at least two independent spells simultaneously. It'll have to be something I properly experiment with later, since I really ought to focus on the crucible at this point in time. The hours go by, and the only thing really keeping me on my toes is the Crucible Master's assistant. Quite frankly, the young man was a worrywart, or at least he seemed especially worried when I wouldn't ask for things. It eventually got to the point where I would ask him to bring me water and potions, just for his peace of mind, rather than for my own sake. Though I couldn't really fault him for his work ethic, he was a very kind and diligent young man, and when I had asked for something to drink while I was running the crucible, he went so far as to hold the cup for me and tilt it so I could drink, without pulling my one hand away from the console. Before I knew it, what looked to be the morning crew for the foundry had started to show up, and began going through the motions for getting their day going. As for how long I had been running my mana through this crucible, well, I'm not entirely sure. It does feel like it's been a long while, and I have definitely been eating away at my stored mana, at least more than I've ever put out in one sitting. If I had to compare it to anything, it feels like I spent more mana than when I built the recreation of my old street back in my mountain. At the very least, I was actively outputting more mana than I could passively recover, but it's not like I've exhausted myself in any noticeable way. I couldn't help but wonder if that was because I didn't have the capability to be physically or mentally exhausted, or if it just wasn't that hard for me, what with my affinity for fire. Even with the increase in activity, I found myself zoning out, as I continued to maintain the intense heat of the crucible. That wasn't until a whistle of some kind broke me from my thoughts, as the men and women started to cheer. I wasn't too sure what was going on, until I finally noticed that between the crucible and the multitude of containers that once had the wolfram ores, everything had finally been processed. "You can stop now, Vito. Thank you for your work today," the assistant mentioned in a distinctly cheerful manner that was apparent even through all the layers of protection that were muffling his voice. "When you mentioned how you were like a dragon with fire, I thought you were exaggerating. But after seeing you work, I can't help but believe your claims. Even the Crucible Master would at least be tired after processing wolfram for 6 hours. But you hardly even look fatigued after all that." "You guys usually only work 6 hours a day?" I asked, as I used some water magic to pull the excess water from my body and stash it into my storage before pulling my shirt back on, now that I was dried off. The assistant shook his head. "No, sir. We work 9-hour days. It's just that when we do get orders for wolfram, the Crucible Master is the only one who is able to maintain the needed heat, and maintain it for long enough to process what needs to be done. As you surely know, the melting point for most ores is much lower, though wolfram and a few others are the exception, and require exceptionally powerful flames to process it." "Of course, I knew that," I mentioned, putting my glove from my storage directly onto my one hand. "How long have I been working, anyway?" I asked, as I glanced over at the assistant while pulling on my cloak. The assistant reaches into the layers of his PPE before pulling out a steel pocket watch and looking it over. Just over 13 hours. It is currently 7:42 in the morning, Vito." "Really? It didn't feel that long." I suppose I must have probably gotten into the zone more times than I realized. The assistant just chuckled a bit before gesturing for me to follow. "If you'll come with me, Guildmaster Tilsum said he would be waiting for you if you were still here when morning came." "Very well," is all I have to say to that, as I fell into step behind the assistant, following him as he led me away from the foundry floor, and into what appears to be a meeting room of some kind. There were multiple chairs around an oval table, and smaller tables along the walls that looked like they were used as drink stations or perhaps even snack stations. It wasn't more than a few minutes when Tilsum stepped in, a broad smile on his face as he looked clearly excited to see me. "Vito, good morning. It is such a good morning indeed," he enthused heartily as he walked over and patted my back. "I should know better by now than to underestimate you, but you continue to surprise me. It's no understatement to say that this guild is truly in your debt now," he explained, as he continued to smile. "With what you've done today, we have now caught up with the current orders of wolfram, and can now reasonably deny future requests until the Crucible Master is well enough to return to his position. Thank you again for all of this, Vito." I just chuckle a little and shake my head at all his thanks. No need to thank me. It was all to further my own endeavors in the end. Tilsum nodded intently, stroking his beard as he considered me. "Well, you can stand to be a little more greedy and selfish, Vito, but I've benefited more than enough from your efforts since we have met. Now it is time for me to return the favor," he explained, as he gestured for me to take a seat at the table, pulling a chair for himself and settling in, as he pulled out a scroll of parchment along with a folder and a small little box from underneath his coat and set it on the table. I could start seeing the semblance of his plan forming in his thoughts, but I opted to let him explain himself, as I took the chair next to him and looked over the documents. "What's all this, then?" Tilsum looked rather pleased as he flashed a toothy smile. "Identification papers. I called in a few favors of my own, and had a few things arranged," he mused, as he tapped his fingers against the table. "For all intents and purposes, you are now a merchant affiliated with Merrill's General Goods and Sundries." I couldn't help but smirk a little bit. What better cover for a hegemony than being just another merchant? "So, I'm playing at being a merchant then?" I asked, as I looked over the documents in question. They weren't nearly as thorough in regards to my background and information as I would expect, but then again, I may be basing myself too much on a modern information network, where someone could be looked up in their entirety with the right string of numbers. Tilson nodded intently, as he leaned forward on the table. Yes, merchants come and go all the time, and with what's in that little box right there, you'll be allowed to go into most places with little scrutiny, as long as you don't cause any overt trouble, or bring any undue attention to yourself, he explained, while gesturing to the little box, as he then slid it closer to me. I plucked the box from the table, holding it in my palm as I used my thumb to open it up. Inside were 2 badges, the ones the elite wore in fact. Those are my old rank 4 badges, and they will hold up just fine to inspection, as they are still the current model used in circulation for elites, as they haven't updated the style in the last 150 years. If it's just a matter of what badge I use, couldn't I just come up with a counterfeit badge on my own for me and my associates? Even as I asked while looking over the badges, I suddenly sensed a small dash of magic coming from the badges themselves. Tilsim smiled as he noticed the change in my expression. Yes, while counterfeits and fakes are common enough, what can't be faked is the magic signature being used to create the badges in question. A single household of gnomes has been charged with the production of the badge for the last 600 years now, the current head of the family taking over in the last 150 years, and updating the magic signature at that point, he explained, apparently more than happy to talk about old history, even if it's starting to feel like these things happened in his lifetime. By the way, I've also arranged for you to take 2 carriages with a couple weeks' worth of food and supplies for your journey, along with any hirelings you take with you. I just need to know what you plan on selling, so I can finish preparing a letter of introduction for you. Now that does take me by surprise. I suppose I shouldn't have been that surprised. After all, a merchant needs to sell something, and if I'm pretending to be a merchant, I'll have to at least put in the token effort. I do have to admit, Tilsim, but I have next to no experience acting as a merchant myself. I have more experience escorting and guarding merchants than anything. Tilsim nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair as he thoughtfully stroked his beard. I figured as much, but at the very least you should know how to act like one if you've been around them. You certainly have the confidence and charisma to be one. As for actually handling merchant business, I'm prepared to assign you a couple of employees who are willing to use this experience to pad out their resumes, he mentioned, as he offered a little smile. Just think of anything you're familiar with, and I'll do my best to procure some materials and goods to fill your carriage, so you can pass inspection. I couldn't help but smile, as I also leaned back in my seat, regarding Tilsim in a new light. You managed to arrange this all in a single night? Tilsim flashed another smile as he met my gaze. Money, might, and merit, Vito. I have plenty of all 3 to call upon. I chuckled softly, before rubbing the back of my neck, as I considered what I could sell convincingly, though a thought does come to mind. Do you have silica sand? I asked. That seemed to draw a blank for Tilsim, as he quoted a brow. Glass-making sand, as well as maybe marble or limestone, and maybe some nice woods. Tilsim looked rather intrigued by the list of goods I put before him, and he nodded intently. I can make some arrangements. The sand will be easy enough, though your carriages may be too weighed down if you also want marble and wood. He started to warn, before remembering just how much iron I seemingly pulled from thin air. Though I suppose that won't actually be a problem for you, he mused cheerfully enough. What do you plan on selling? I just hold out my palm, pulling a stone from my storage as I first rounded it into a smooth sphere, before focusing a little more, as I make it take the shape of a coral snake with a tail in its mouth. Sculptures, figurines, and maybe even some toys if I feel like it. Tilsim just clapped his hands loudly together before grinning with delight. It sounds like we're in business. Let's get the ball rolling then. Chris POV. Chris found himself eating at a rather nice inn in the inner ring. It felt like a rather odd experience if he was being honest. The ambience was just distinctly nicer than that of the taverns of the Outer Ring. Despite the number of armed and armoured individuals that were around, it felt like there was even less of a chance for a random fight to break out among the patrons. His right side felt heavier than usual, as he considered the wolf-steel mace that now hung from his hip by a strap. He usually didn't carry weapons on him beyond the odd knife or two for cutting purses or self-defense, but considering how far he was travelling, he had a feeling he would need more than just a knife if he wanted to keep himself and Ren safe. In fact, his whole body felt a little off balance at all his new equipment, as he considered the mix of leather and cloth armour he outfitted himself with, and he wasn't the only one. Zax and Sarah were wearing similar sets of light armour, though Zax had gotten his hands on a one-handed warhammer, whereas Sarah got a light wooden crossbow and quite a few knives which she strapped to various points of her body. Looking to his left, Ren was sitting by his side looking rather cheerful, as she hummed to herself while digging into some pancakes that were drizzled with syrup. Her ears waggled with every bite underneath the dark blue hood of her new cloak. "Those look pretty good, kiddo, if the syrup on your chin is anything to go by," Sarah said, while watching Ren, flashing a mischievous little smile as she poked at her eggs, before plucking a piece of bacon from her plate. Ren smiled, though she looked a little embarrassed as she hadn't realised how messy she had let herself get, grabbing a napkin to wipe her face. "Sorry, they really are very good. You should learn how to make these things. I'm sure yours would be better," she mentioned, as she looked up to Chris with a playful look, before cutting into her pancakes some more. Chris couldn't help but chuckle at her comment as he took up his mug of coffee. "Sure, I'll make sure to put that on the list," he mused before taking a sip. Zax was chowing down eagerly enough, taking a big spoonful of hash browns into his mouth and chewing fairly noisily as he absently began looking around the inn's dining area. He at least had the good tact to not talk with his mouth full, swallowing as he spoke up. "So why do we shout so early if the guy's just going to make us wait?" Chris just shrugged a little, scratching the back of his head for his hood as he surveyed the inn from where they sat. "I'm not sure. He said the first thing in the morning, but maybe something came up," he considered, glancing over at Ren wordlessly before regarding Zax and Sarah as he lowered his voice. "All I know is that he's not going to let us get off that easily, after letting us have that much coin with everything that happened, that's for sure." Zax just grunted in agreement as he went back to his food. Sarah remained quiet as she grabbed a couple of bread rolls from the basket on the table and stashed them away before going back to eating what was on her plate. After a few more minutes, a conversation at the front counter caused Chris's ears to perk. Pulling his hood back to eavesdrop better, he listened in as a woman asked the innkeeper's son for directions to a certain room and asked after Vito's associates. He smiled a little bit as he looked at Ren and his team. "Sounds like that's our cue," he murmured while grabbing his things. As the woman headed up the stairs, the innkeeper's son stepped away from the counter before looking among the inn's dining room and just calling out, "If Mr. Vito's associates could please make themselves known, he has a representative here to escort you over to him." As Chris approached with his team, another trio approached, led by an armoured human with a club and sword at their hip, and followed by a human mage and a dogkin girl. They all appeared to be a little younger than his team, but they certainly looked strong. "Oh? Who are all you?" the team mage asked, as he leaned on a rather ornate-looking staff.